Hi everybody. In this clip, what we're going to be doing is starting to actually sculpt out a little bit more of our design. So the big thing that we've got here is our basic structure. We know that we've got our shovel element here. We know that we've got our sort of hilt here. We've got this section. We could add in, if we wanted to, just one last piece here. So let's do this a little bit more organically. We want that handle. So there's a couple ways that we could do that. So one, I'm going to use my transpose tool, drag down, and I'm going to hold control. And that's going to allow me to sort of duplicate this geometry within my subtool. So this is really handy. This means that I'll be able to just kind of duplicate the information that's there and kind of push it down. Now, what you'll see in my subtool palette here is that I still only have one subtool, and they're split up by masking. So that's pretty good. Now, what I could do is start to take this and pull it in a bit. Let's pull that in through the center, because I think that'll be a better point for this. There we go. I use the polyframe here just to make sure that I can see exactly what it is that I'm working with here, and so that I can snap to that center point. So let's just pull that out there. And in this case too, I will also taper this with the use of my clip mask, just kind of pulling that out there to create a clip. Now in this case, I want to make sure that my snapping is turned, or my symmetry is turned on, and just kind of come in here like this and just make that nice shape. So that's pretty good. And I'll just use this like that. And the reason this area is not affected by my transpose tool is because it is masked. If I get rid of the mask by creating a mask in an empty space, then both of them will be affected as I do this. I could also mask down here, click, control, and we see that this will show up differently now. So that's good. We've got a pretty good setup there. I can just kind of create that big simple shape through here, and even with some organicness to it, because again, I'm using some transpose tools and I'm keeping things pretty clean, but honestly in the end the move tool will allow me to get a whole bunch of the shapes that I want here. One thing that I may want to do is turn on a bit of a different symmetry though. So if I go over here to the local symmetry area and alt click, I'm going to see the symmetry and transform options show up off to the side. This is how I access a lot of these menus, or for my custom shortcut I press A, and I'm able to access my brush settings here with my symmetries. So I am going to turn on the y-axis. Let's just see if that's what I want. Nope, that's vertical. So I'm going to get the z-axis, which will also affect this back area. I can have multiple symmetries turned on at once. The reason I want to do this is so that when I affect any of the geometry in this direction, so as I try to move stuff down and adjust, I'm going to get all that option, all that information happening on both sides. Then I'll just kind of clip, clip, and that's just going to flatten the information in both areas. If you get stuff like this showing up, it's not a big deal. Just kind of re-flatten that there. Because it's not actually cutting the geometry, it's just flattening along a certain direction. But this gives me the basic idea of what I'm working with. The reason that I like to use ZBrush in this way is because it allows me to kind of move the proportions of things really easily. So if I alt-click, I can take this piece and kind of pull it up a little bit more. Maybe grab this part here, start to pull out with Alt, maybe increase the size of that piece, or maybe decrease the size of it. I'm not getting too caught up in finicky little details in general. It may seem like it, but I'm not. The main thing that I want to do when I'm building out these kind of structures and shapes is to figure out, like, what is the general shape of this thing? How is it going to work? And what is the refined elements that are in it? So that's pretty good to start with, but I want to figure out some information that's going to go on here. So this is a pretty decent handle, but what else can I do with it? Well, let's use my move brush and start to pull out certain shapes here. Maybe let's start to pull some of this up. We get a fair amount of control out of this. This starts to look a little bit too big in that direction, so I'm just going to kind of push and pull to kind of push these things in. The nice thing is, because I'm using the z-axis symmetry, these parts actually will push together and create some shapes that I might actually want. And again, pulling some of this geometry down is somewhat useful because there's so few pieces of geometry here. I actually get a fair amount of control that you wouldn't expect. So that's pretty good. Again, I generally recommend that the less geometry you have when you're starting out with this, the better. But this is a pretty interesting shape and relatively similar to what I was starting to concept out in general. I'm going to pull this part down a little bit more and extend the length of this. Again, I'm holding Alt to just pull this section up so that I'm not extending that blade section and making it too sharp. So I still want that to look like a actual shovel shape. So that's pretty good. That's pretty interesting. So now this section down here is pretty good. Let's pull this out. I'm just Alt-clicking each time to get access to each of these parts. and masking so that I'm only moving certain sections. That's pretty good. That's relatively interesting. This starts to look quite a bit like a shovel, maybe a little bit too much. I could change the proportions again, but let's come back up here to my actual shovel blade. I'd like to give it some dimensionality. I'd like to have some sort of thickness to it. So to do that, what I'm going to do is just, let's close up our transform here, scroll down into our geometry section. Now, one of the things that I think is really useful is when you're working with one of these flat pieces, like I've been working with, there's a reason for it. I like working with these flat pieces because it has no thickness to it, which means when I decide to give it thickness, that thickness will stay consistent. So in this case, what I'm going to do is go into my edge loop section here. This is a confusing spot for what I'm about to use because it's not necessarily changing edge loops as much as adding thickness to this object. Panel loops. Panel loops is a great tool for adding thickness to surfaces like this. I use it a lot. If I click panel loops right now, what'll happen is it'll basically totally destroy my geometry and make it flat. So this does not seem like a great example for it, but if we zoom in real close, we can see that we've got a little bit of thickness to this model now, but not nearly enough. So how do we fix what's going on here? Well, first off, there's a few things that panel loops does. First off, it polishes my model. So if I increase the thickness here, we'll get an obvious result. Now I have much more obvious thickness. Let's go even more than that. Pull that out. Ooh, that's too much. These small amounts are very confusing. You basically just have to kind of fiddle with it, and you'll get a good sense for what that size should be. But again, smoothing it out. That's that polish operation. It's going to polish everything that it's working with, so it smooths the whole thing out, which is not what I want in this case. So I'm going to take that polish, I'm going to drop it down to 0, press panel loops again, and I get the shape that I actually wanted. So that looks great. That gives me the thickness that I needed, and I can use my transpose to kind of push this back a little bit more into a shape that I think is a bit more manageable for me. So that's great. Now I can maybe pull some of these bottom sections in, just kind of starting to push this in a little bit more here. Maybe that's the shape that I want, but it's a little bit too low poly at the moment. I want a little bit more shape out of that. So what I can do is just drop back down here into my Dynamesh, and you can see here I could just turn that back on. I'm going to turn Reproject Dynamesh off, and I'm going to take that resolution down a little bit. So that's a little bit too low, as we can see here. It's losing some of the shape a little bit too much. Let's go a little bit higher. Do that again. A little bit too high this time. This is usually what I end up fiddling with quite a bit, is just to try to get that right resolution. This is pretty good, but let's go just a little bit higher. There we go. That's an amount that I like and generally works for this shape. What this means is also now that I can start to adjust the shape of this a little bit more. If I wanted to get a little bit more of a taper in some of these pieces, I can't quite get that taper because my movement's just a little bit too soft. Make sure that you change your focal shift. So if I change my focal shift to a small point in the center, then when I do this operation, I can get a much smaller point kind of coming out of that. It's really handy, gives you just a bit of an ability to taper things just a little bit more than you were doing before. So that's pretty decent. I could maybe even start to bend that a little bit, see if that shape works. This is where you really start to figure out what the structure and shape of your object can be. Can I get away with this kind of curve in my concept or not? This is really, really important. It's incredibly invaluable for a concept artist to be able to work with because they can figure out large proportional changes to their work while figuring out other elements as well. I'll just use my standard brush to kind of make that little other divot that usually shows up in here. That's pretty decent. Could pull that out a bit more with just my move brush. But this gives me a lot of control over my concept, so I can start to figure out if certain details are working or not. And if I want to go back in time, I can usually just use Control Z and start to move things back, or I can just drag this line back and I'll start to see all those changes happen. Now these happen per subtool. So for example, when I go back on this piece, there we go, I could still alt-click this and still start to move back in time on this piece individually to wherever I want. Now, this history can also be saved out in your preferences or not. Sometimes that can take a little bit longer to save those history changes, but they can be useful. So that's pretty decent. I've got a basic structure here. Now, let's look at refining that in our next clip.